Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. When we last left King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, they were almost killed when the Germans bombed Buckingham Palace. That episode was intense. The Germans were bombing every day, and the people of England refused to give up. They had courage, and I admire them. The King and Queen didn't give up either, and try to keep everyone's spirits up. So let's see what they're up to today. The bombing at the palace was helpful to the King and Queen and to the country. Some members of Parliament were worried that if the bombing stayed in the working class areas, resentment would grow. The Queen said more than once that she was glad that the palace had been bombed because it meant that she could now look at the East End in the face. She was right, it did make a closer bond. The King told Queen Mary that the visits to the bombed areas helped the people who had lost their relations and homes, and he said, "We have both found a new bond with them, as Buckingham Palace has been bombed as well as their homes, and nobody is immune." The Queen said that people would ask her how she felt about being attacked, and a voluntary worker in one stricken area said to the Queen, as they try and salvage their own bundles of belongings from their ruined homes, "Did the Queen lose all her pretty things too?" On one such visit to southeast London, Lord Woolton, the Minister of Food, was with him. The Queen asked him about the morale of the people who had been bombed, and Lord Woolton said that they were going through a very slummy district, and a crowd gathered around the carriage and called out, "Good luck and God bless you, and thank you, Your Majesties, for coming to see us." He said the district had been there only a week before, and he told her, "You asked me about the morale. All these people have lost their homes." And the Queen was so touched that she couldn't speak for a moment, and he said, "I saw tears come into her eyes," and then she said, "I think they're wonderful." Lord Woolton liked the simplicity of the King and Queen. They were easy to talk to and take around, and they had conversations with people, and without hesitation, they spoke to the crowds. He said they were very nice people, doing a very human job. When they went to Bermondsey, the chairman of the National Council of Girls' Clubs, Mrs. Walter Elliot, she wrote to the Queen's lady-in-waiting, "Everyone in town believed Her Majesty came to see them because she had heard there had been a direct hit on a shelter and had wanted to help them. The people felt as if an angel had passed through their midst." The Queen's gowns in wartime was a source of worry. The King looked elegant in uniform throughout the war, and the Queen had difficulty deciding what she should wear. She knew press photographers tended to show her plumpness rather than her clear skin, let alone her charm. Her dressmaker, Norman Harnell, advised that she had to stand out in the crowd, and since most of the people would be in dark clothes or drabbily dressed, she should wear light colors. Hartnell said that they wondered if she should appear in black, but black didn't convey in the rainbow of hope. The Queen decided on gentle colors, dusky pink, dusky blue, dusty lilac. She never wore green, and she never wore black. The Queen wanted to convey the most comforting, encouraging, and sympathetic note possible. She did stand out in the bomb areas. It was encouraging for the people that had lost everything to see the Queen still had her style. Throughout the Battle of Britain, the King and Queen drove to London almost every day and slept at Windsor Castle with their daughters. They slept on the ground of the Victoria Tower, now the Queen's Tower. It was protected outside by huge concrete frames filled with sand, while more extensive reinforcing works took place. The whole tower was clothed in scaffolding, and a 10-inch raft of concrete, steel, and asbestos was built across the roof. The 4 rooms in the cellar were given added protection by constructing a 4 feet thick roof of concrete, and it had girders across the ground floor. In the early days of the war, the inhabitants of the castle were alerted to air raids, not only by outside sirens, but also by loud electric bells which clanged through the corridors. Later, after the war, Queen Elizabeth recalled that one of the princess's nannies always wore a nightcap to the shelter. I think Queen Elizabeth said she thought it was to be decent in the war. The Queen wore a gown that Hartnell made her, especially for air raid nights, and he made her a black velvet case for her gas mask. Windsor was attacked on 2 consecutive nights, October 1940. The castle wasn't hit, thank God. And the Queen wrote to her sister May that it was the first time that the children had actually heard the whistle and the scream of bombs. The Queen said they were wonderful, and when I went to say goodnight to Margaret in her bed, I said I hoped that she wasn't frightened, etc. She said, "Mummy, it was just like when you take a photograph that doesn't come out all gray and blurred, and you see several hands and arms instead of one. And it's so true, really, very much what one feels like." After the raid, the Queen visited bombed areas of Windsor and followed up by sending blankets to some houses that were destroyed. The castle was never warm in the winter. The high rooms were hard to heat, and the wind whistled through the tall windows. The king would sit in his room with a traveling rug wrapped around his feet because of the drafts on the floor. To help ease the cold, electric radiators were installed in the window bays. The western end of St. George's Hall, there was a temporary stage in which the two princesses and their friends from time to time put on shows. They played the piano and tap danced and put on a performance of the Mad Hatter's Tea Party from Alice in Wonderland. Princess Margaret played the Dormouse. In the audience was the company of the Grenadier Guards, who were stationed at the castle Mews to protect the royal family. Most of the time, though, the princesses were alone with their governesses and a castle official and perhaps Gerald Kelly, the portraitist. In October 1940, Neville Chamberlain suddenly became gravely ill and had to resign from the War Cabinet. He was near death. The King and the Queen drove to visit him. Chamberlain was touched, and his wife, Anne, wrote to the Queen to thank them for their characteristic kindness. Chamberlain died on November the 10th. Churchill was a pallbearer at his funeral and was generous in his tribute in the House of Commons, saying that all of Chamberlain's noble hopes for peace had been disappointed and cheated by a wicked man. By autumn, the threat of imminent invasion had receded, but London was still under constant attack. The King and Queen's first married home in London, 145 Piccadilly, was destroyed. Kensington Palace was bombed, and a landmine exploded just opposite Buckingham Palace in St. James's Park, blowing out all the windows and frames in the front of the palace. By now there wasn't hardly any glass left in the windows. They had to be boarded up with cardboard. The Queen was distressed that the beauty of the Georgian and Regency London was being smashed and was concerned that the rebuilding would be without taste, and the author said she was right. She said it really makes one wild with rage to see all the insane destruction of beautiful and often dearly loved buildings. She wished the German embassy had been bombed instead. I believe the interior had been made very vulgar by that horrible Ribbentrop, and it would have been no loss. In Stoke Newton, in mid-October 1940, the King and Queen watched as people were being dug out of flats which had collapsed upon them. The bomb burst a water main, and many who survived the bombs were then drowned. The Queen wrote that she hated the expeditions, but they were essential. She said this to Queen Mary. She said she felt exhausted after seeing so much sadness, sorrow, heroism, and magnificent spirit. The destruction, she said, was so awful, and the people too wonderful. They deserve a better world. She was determined not to show emotion or show how upset she was. Sometimes the chief constable wept, but she never broke down, said one lady-in-waiting. The Queen felt it all intensely, and she wrote her sister May, "Sometimes it really makes me feel almost ill. I can't tell you how I loathe going around these bombed places. I'm a beastly coward, and it breaks one's heart to see so much misery and sadness." In their visits around the city, there was often air raid warnings, and the Queen said, "I think we must have taken refuge in every single police station in London, and we were always given a cup of very, very strong tea." The Queen would wake up early and lie in bed worrying. She thought of all the blows that had already befallen Britain, and all of those which could still come. But she had hope. She felt that the war was bringing out the best in people. Before the war, the Queen wrote to Queen Mary in October 1940 that the people were materialistic, but now the people were living as truly Christian life, being good neighbors and living for each other as never before, which with the things of the Spirit seemed to me to be real Christianity. The royal Christmas card that year was a photograph of the King and the Queen standing in the bomb-damaged palace. The two princesses took part in a nativity play at Windsor Castle. Princess Elizabeth was one of the three kings. She walked the length of St. George's Hall with her gift to the infant Jesus. Princess Margaret took the part of a child whose gift was herself and sang Gentle Jesus at the crib. Her father was proud of her and said she played her part remarkably well and wasn't shy. He was overcome by emotions the play evoked. He said, "I wept through most of it. It's such a wonderful story." December 27th, they drove up to Norfolk to have a few days of rest on the Sandringham estate. The big house had been closed for the war. It was surrounded by barbed wire, and there were many shrubs and trees cut down by the orders of the King. The Queen thought it looked forlorn and uncherished. They now lived in Appleton, a small house nearby. It had been the home of Queen Maud of Norway, who had lived there in 1938. It was a less obvious target for the German bombers than Sandringham itself. They were protected by an armored car unit and 4 Beaufort guns, and there was a reinforced concrete air raid shelter in the trees close by. The staff put carpets and furniture from Sandringham House into Appleton, and it was warm and comfortable. Queen Elizabeth wrote to Queen Mary in 1941 talking about the princesses. She said, "I'm afraid that Windsor is not really a very good place for them. The noise of guns is heavy, and then, of course, there have been so many bombs dropped all around, and some so close." The Queen said the snow was stuck on the ground, but the King went out shooting every day, and she thought he looked better by doing it, and the Queen tried to relax. Thanks to Churchill, with his encouragement and the mistakes of Hitler, Britain survived, but barely. In 1941, Britain was standing alone and things were terrible. America was the key. The King and Churchill were working to get America to Britain's side, and it took a long time to achieve. Roosevelt felt sympathy for the democracy of Britain, but it wasn't easy. The Americans were impressed by the courage of the British resisting Hitler, but most of the American people, as well as the political class, didn't want to get involved in another European war. In January 1941, Harry Hopkins arrived in London. He was the personal representative of President Roosevelt. The King and Queen met with him, and the Queen said he was very helpful and all out for our cause, a very nice American. Hopkins thought well of her, too. They took cover together during an air raid, and he wrote afterwards, "The Queen told me that she found it extremely difficult to find words to express her feelings towards the people of Britain in these days. She thought their actions were magnificent, and that victory in the long run was sure, but that the one big thing that counted was the morale and determination of the great mass of the British people." Hopkins arranged with Churchill a new basis for the purchase of an American material, which was intended to make arms and supplies available to governments whose defense was considered vital to the defense of the United States. The Lend-Lease Act passed by Congress on March 11th gave Britain extended credit, allowing the country to buy equipment, oil, and other supplies, which would not have to be paid for until the end of the war. And this was generous as the United States could be. Britain was now mortgaged to the United States. The war debt was finally paid off in 2007. So there was a new fear of invasion. The King talked it over with Churchill regarding the risk to his family and to the government. The Prime Minister told him that he planned to stay in London as long as possible. The King knew he would have to remain with the government. He could not delegate his powers. The Queen and princesses would be rushed to the country. The Queen, she had a bad experience in February 1941. One evening she was in her room at the castle, and a man sprang out at her from behind the curtains and grabbed her ankles. The Queen had said this, and then for a moment, she said, my heart stood absolutely still. She knew the man must be mentally disturbed and worried that if she screamed, she would be attacked. She quietly said, "Tell me about it." The man said he was a deserter and his family had been killed in the Blitz, and while he was talking, she moved calmly across the room to ring the bell. Later, the Queen said, "Poor man, I felt so sorry for him. I realized quickly that he didn't mean any harm." It was a breach of security which was alarming. The intruder had been taken on as an electrician from the Ministry of Labor, and his references hadn't been checked. The Office of Works gave him a pass, and he was able to walk straight into the castle, into the private rooms, and out again. Lord Wigram, who was governor of the castle, was responsible for security, and was horrified and ordered that regulations be tightened. That month, the King and Queen went to Manchester after a heavy raid, and they saw houses which had been built near the factories collapse like packs of cards. The Queen was impressed by the people's spirits, despite all that had happened to them. The Australian Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, paid a visit to London at this time. He stayed the night at Windsor and dined alone with the King and Queen. They impressed him. He said the King had no stammer and speaks often loudly with a kind of excitement, and he said the Queen looks older but as fascinating as ever, and he wrote this in his diary. Menzies said that she was as wise as possible and has the shrewdest estimate of all the cabinet. I'm going to end the video here. The King and Queen made visits to cities every time they were bombed. The people kept their morale high even when they lost their homes and most of their possessions. The people amazed the King and Queen, and they kept the King and Queen determined too. Britain was trying to get help from America, but even though Roosevelt was sympathetic to their cause, the majority of Americans didn't want to get involved in another European war. They loaned Britain money, and that didn't have to be paid until after the war to help out. And it was scary that a man who was mentally not there got into the Queen's bedroom and came out behind a curtain and grabbed her ankles. The Queen, just as Queen Elizabeth did years later when she was a queen herself, remained calm, and she managed to ring a bell and help came. The war had to be such a stressful time for all in England as they tried to fight against the Nazis by themselves. I can't believe all they had to endure, and I'm anxious to find out more about this period of the King and Queen's lives during this time. And we'll do that in the next video. I hope that everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would really be greatly appreciated. It would also help to enable more people to find out about my videos. So I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.